Captain Marcus Thornfield had served the royal family for 15 years, but he had never faced a situation quite like this. The grand halls of Eldermere Palace echoed with tension as he stood outside the ornate doors of Princess Isabel's chambers. The 8-year-old princess was the kingdom's most precious treasure, beloved by all who knew her gentle spirit and infectious laughter. Today, however, laughter was the furthest thing from anyone's mind. The recent arrival of Lady Cordelia Blackthorne as the princess's new governess had created an atmosphere of unease that seemed to permeate the very walls of the palace. Lady Blackthorne came with impeccable credentials from the neighboring kingdom of Ravencrest, recommended by influential nobles who spoke of her strict but effective methods of education. Marcus remembered the day she arrived. Tall and imposing, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, Lady Blackthorne carried herself with an air of authority that made even the senior palace staff uncomfortable. Her pale blue eyes seemed to miss nothing, and her thin lips rarely curved into anything resembling a smile. She wore dark, conservative dresses that rustled ominously as she moved through the corridors, and her sharp voice could be heard giving orders to servants and staff alike. The princess had initially tried to welcome her new governess with the same warmth she showed everyone. Isabel had picked flowers from the palace gardens, drawn pictures during her art lessons, and even attempted to share stories about her favorite books. But Lady Blackthorne had received these gestures with cold indifference, dismissing them as frivolous distractions from serious study. Within days, the change in Princess Isabel was noticeable. The child who once ran through the halls with joy now walked quietly, her eyes downcast. Her usual chatter during meals had been replaced by silence, and the servants whispered among themselves about hearing muffled crying from her chambers late at night. When questioned, the princess would only say that Lady Blackthorne believed children should be seen and not heard, and that her previous education had been far too lenient. Marcus had tried to discuss his concerns with Lord Chancellor Pemberton, the elderly administrator who oversaw much of the palace's daily operations. However, Pemberton was a cautious man who feared making waves with the influential nobles who had recommended Lady Blackthorne. He insisted that adjustment periods were normal, and that the princess simply needed time to adapt to more rigorous academic standards. The other palace staff shared Marcus's concerns. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the head housekeeper who had helped raise the princess since infancy, frequently found excuses to check on Isabel's well-being. She reported that the child seemed increasingly withdrawn and nervous, jumping at sudden sounds and apologizing excessively for minor mistakes. The palace cook, Thomas Brightheart, mentioned that the princess barely touched her meals anymore, claiming she wasn't hungry, despite having always enjoyed her food previously. Even Sir Edmund Ashworth, the princess's longtime tutor in history and literature, had been replaced by Lady Blackthorne's own methods. Sir Edmund had taught through engaging stories and interactive lessons that captured Isabel's imagination. Under Lady Blackthorne's instruction, learning became a rigid exercise in memorization and repetition, with harsh criticism for any mistakes or moments of creativity. The breaking point came on a particularly stormy afternoon. Marcus was making his routine rounds of the palace's upper floors when he heard raised voices coming from the princess's study. Lady Blackthorne's sharp tone carried clearly through the heavy wooden door, berating the child for some perceived failure in her lessons. Marcus paused, his hand instinctively moving to the sword at his side, as he heard the governess's voice grow increasingly harsh. What troubled him most was not just the severity of the scolding, but the complete absence of any response from Princess Isabel. In the past, the spirited child would have defended herself or at least asked questions when corrected. Now, there was only silence, broken occasionally by what sounded like muffled sniffles. The contrast between the woman's harsh words and the child's quiet submission created a knot of anger in Marcus's stomach. As he stood there, torn between his duty to protect the royal family and his orders to respect the authority of appointed staff, Marcus realized that something had to change. The princess's welfare was his primary responsibility, regardless of political considerations or diplomatic niceties. The question was how to proceed without overstepping his bounds or creating a scandal that could damage the kingdom's relationships with neighboring countries. That evening, as he walked the halls during his night patrol, Marcus made a decision. He would begin documenting everything he observed, gathering evidence of Lady Blackthorne's treatment of the princess. If his suspicions proved correct, he would need proof to convince the royal council that action needed to be taken. The safety and happiness of Princess Isabel depended on someone being willing to stand up for her, even if it meant risking his own position. The storm outside intensified, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it was an omen of the conflict to come. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus began his careful documentation, and the evidence was becoming increasingly disturbing. Hidden in his private quarters was a leather journal filled with detailed observations of Princess Isabel's declining condition and Lady Blackthorn's increasingly harsh methods. Each entry painted a picture of psychological manipulation that made his blood boil. The princess had developed several troubling habits. She would flinch whenever footsteps approached her chambers, and she had begun apologizing for things that weren't her fault. During the few times Marcus caught glimpses of her in the gardens, he noticed she kept her head down and spoke in whispers, a stark contrast to the confident, joyful child she had been just months before. Mrs. Sepulty's work. Hartwell had become an invaluable ally in Marcus's investigation. The motherly housekeeper had served the royal family for over 30 years and had helped raise Princess Isabel's late mother. Her observations were particularly heartbreaking. She reported finding the princess hiding in closets during what should have been her free time, claiming she was practicing being invisible because Lady Blackthorn had told her that children should not draw attention to themselves. The governess had also implemented a system of punishments that seemed designed to break the child's spirit rather than teach proper behavior. Princess Isabel was frequently denied meals for minor infractions such as asking questions during lessons or displaying too much enthusiasm about her studies. She was made to stand in corners for hours at a time, supposedly to reflect on her behavior, and was forbidden from speaking to the servants who had been her friends and confidants. Most troubling of all were the reports from the night guards who patrolled the corridors near the royal chambers. They had begun hearing what sounded like quiet sobbing from the princess's room well into the night, followed by harsh whispers that could only be coming from Lady Blackthorn. The governess had moved her own quarters to the room adjacent to the princess's, claiming it was necessary for proper supervision and education. Sir Edmund Ashworth had sought out Marcus privately, expressing his own concerns about the changes he had observed in his former pupil. The scholarly gentleman had been devastated when his services were no longer required, not because of his wounded pride, but because of his genuine affection for the intelligent and curious princess. He reported that during brief encounters in the halls, Isabel seemed afraid to acknowledge him, looking away quickly whenever their paths crossed. The political situation complicated matters significantly. Lady Blackthorn's appointment had been part of a larger diplomatic initiative to strengthen ties with the kingdom of Ravencrest. The noble families who had recommended her held considerable influence in both kingdoms, and any action against her could be seen as a diplomatic insult. Lord Chancellor Pemberton had made it clear that he would not consider any complaints without overwhelming evidence of serious wrongdoing. Marcus had attempted to arrange a private meeting with the princess, hoping to assess her condition firsthand and perhaps offer some comfort. However, Lady Blackthorn had established strict rules about access to her charge. All interactions had to be approved in advance and conducted in her presence. When Marcus had suggested that the princess might benefit from spending time with her old friends among the staff, he was curtly informed that such familiarity was inappropriate and would not be tolerated. The captain's frustration grew daily as he watched the vibrant child he had sworn to protect slowly disappearing before his eyes. His fellow guards had begun to notice his increased vigilance around the princess's chambers, and some had quietly offered their support if action needed to be taken. The loyalty and affection the entire palace staff felt for Princess Isabel created an undercurrent of rebellion against Lady Blackthorn's regime. The situation reached a new level of urgency when Mrs. Hartwell made a disturbing discovery. While cleaning the princess's chambers, she had found several drawings hidden beneath the mattress. The artwork, which had once been filled with rainbows, flowers, and smiling faces, now depicted dark figures looming over small, frightened children. In one particularly heartbreaking image, a little girl stood alone in a corner while a tall, angular woman pointed an accusatory finger at her. That same evening, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. During his patrol, he heard voices coming from the direction of the princess's chambers once again. But this time, something was different. Lady Blackthorn's voice carried a tone of barely controlled rage that sent chills down his spine. He moved closer to the door, straining to hear the words being spoken. What he heard made his blood freeze. The governess was berating the 8-year-old child with a cruelty that went far beyond strict discipline. She was systematically attacking every aspect of the princess's character, telling her she was stupid, worthless, and a disappointment to everyone who knew her. The psychological abuse was deliberate and calculated, designed to destroy the child's self-confidence and spirit. Marcus realized that he could no longer wait for proper channels or political considerations. The princess was in immediate danger, and every day that passed under Lady Blackthorn's care was causing irreparable harm. He would need to act quickly and decisively, regardless of the consequences to his career or the kingdom's diplomatic relationships. As he stood in the darkened corridor, his hand gripping his sword hilt with white knuckles, Marcus began formulating a plan that would require courage, cunning, and the help of every person in the palace who truly cared about Princess Isabel's well-being. Part 3. The next morning brought an opportunity that Marcus had been waiting for. Lady Blackthorn was scheduled to meet with Lord Chancellor Pemberton to discuss the princess's progress and to request additional disciplinary authority. This meeting would take her away from the royal chambers for at least an hour, providing the first real chance Marcus had to speak with Princess Isabel privately. He waited until the governess's sharp footsteps disappeared down the marble corridor before approaching the princess's door. Hartwell had strategically positioned herself nearby, ostensibly organizing linens but actually serving as a lookout. Sir Edmund had also volunteered to create a distraction if Lady Blackthorn returned unexpectedly, ready to engage her in conversation about educational philosophy. Marcus knocked gently on the door and identified himself. The small voice that answered seemed surprised and cautious. When he entered, he found Princess Isabel sitting rigidly at her study desk, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap exactly as she had been trained. The transformation was shocking. The lively, confident child he remembered had been replaced by a nervous, subdued figure who seemed afraid to move without permission. "Your Highness," Marcus said softly, kneeling down to her level to appear less intimidating. "I wanted to check on how you're doing. We haven't had a chance to talk in quite some time." The princess looked toward the door nervously, before responding in a whisper. "Lady Blackthorn says I'm not supposed to have conversations that aren't about my lessons. She says it's important for me to focus on improving myself because I have so many faults that need correction." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. This intelligent, creative child had been convinced that she was somehow defective and in need of constant correction. He could see the fear in her eyes and the way she held herself, as if expecting punishment for even this brief conversation. "Princess Isabel," Marcus said carefully, "do you remember when we used to walk in the gardens together? You would tell me about the books you were reading and show me the flowers you had discovered. You were always so curious about everything." A flicker of the old Isabel appeared in her eyes for a moment before being quickly suppressed. "Lady Blackthorn says curiosity is a sign of an undisciplined mind. She says asking too many questions shows disrespect for authority and that good children accept what they're told without argument." Marcus felt his anger building but forced himself to remain calm. He needed to assess the full extent of the psychological damage while being careful not to put the princess in further danger. "How do you feel about your lessons with Lady Blackthorn? Are you learning things that interest you?" The princess's response revealed the depth of the manipulation she had endured. She explained that Lady Blackthorn had convinced her that her previous education had been completely inadequate, that everyone who had taught her before had been doing her a disservice by making learning enjoyable. She had been told that suffering through difficult and boring lessons was the only way to become worthy of her royal position. Even more disturbing was the princess's description of the reflection time she was required to spend each evening. Lady Blackthorn would make her list all of her mistakes and failures from the day, then meditate on how she could be better. The child had internalized these sessions to the point where she genuinely believed she was a burden to everyone around her. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway with a concerned expression, signaling that Lady Blackthorn's meeting had ended earlier than expected. Marcus quickly reassured the princess that their conversation would remain private and that she should continue following Lady Blackthorn's instructions for now. He could see the confusion in her eyes as he left, probably wondering why he would tell her to continue obeying someone he seemed concerned about. The encounter had provided Marcus with the confirmation he needed. but it had also revealed that the situation was even worse than he had imagined. Princess Isabel had been systematically broken down and rebuilt according to Lady Blackthorn's twisted vision of what a royal child should be. The psychological scars from this treatment might take years to heal, assuming intervention happened quickly enough to prevent permanent damage.
That afternoon, Marcus called a secret meeting with Mrs. Hartwell, Sir Edmund, and Thomas the cook in the old servants' quarters beneath the palace.
He shared his observations and his growing conviction that immediate action was necessary. The group agreed that they could no longer rely on proper channels or hope that someone else would intervene. Sir Edmund revealed that he had been conducting his own investigation and had discovered some troubling information about Lady Blackthorn's previous positions. While her credentials appeared impressive on the surface, he had found hints that she had been dismissed from at least 2 previous households under mysterious circumstances. Unfortunately, the details were difficult to verify due to the privacy maintained by noble families about their internal affairs. Hartwell shared her own disturbing observation from that morning. She had noticed that Lady Blackthorn kept detailed notes about Princess Isabel's behavior, but these notes seemed focused more on recording instances of defiance or inappropriate responses than actual educational progress. It appeared the governess was building a case to justify even harsher treatment in the future. The group realized that they would need to take significant risks to protect the princess. Any action they took would likely result in their dismissal and could potentially be seen as treason depending on how the situation was handled. However, their loyalty to Princess Isabel and their recognition of the ongoing abuse made the choice clear. Marcus outlined a plan that would require careful timing and the cooperation of several palace staff members. They would need to document evidence of Lady Blackthorn's abuse, ensure the princess's immediate safety, and present their case to someone with enough authority and integrity to take decisive action. The challenge was that most of the palace's senior officials were either too politically cautious or too influenced by the diplomatic considerations surrounding Lady Blackthorn's appointment. As the secret meeting concluded, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. The next few days would determine not only Princess Isabel's future, but potentially the fate of everyone who chose to stand up for her. The risks were enormous, but the cost of inaction was even greater. Part 4. 2 days after the secret meeting, the opportunity Marcus had been waiting for finally presented itself. The king and queen had been away on a diplomatic mission to the southern provinces, but they were scheduled to return the following evening. Marcus knew that he would have only one chance to present his evidence directly to their majesties before Lady Blackthorn could spin her own version of events, or the political machinery could suppress his report. However, first he needed to gather one final piece of evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Mrs. Hartwell had discovered that Lady Blackthorn had been keeping Princess Isabel awake for hours past her normal bedtime under the guise of additional study time. These late-night sessions were when the most severe psychological abuse occurred, taking advantage of the child's exhaustion and vulnerability. Marcus planned to position himself outside the princess's chambers during one of these sessions to witness and document the abuse firsthand. Sir Edmund would serve as a backup witness, while Mrs. Hartwell would ensure that their activities weren't discovered by other staff members who might report back to Lady Blackthorn. As darkness fell over the palace, Marcus took up his position in an alcove near the royal chambers. The governess had established a routine of conducting these special lessons around 10 o'clock each evening, well after the normal household had retired for the night. The corridor was dimly lit by flickering torches, creating an atmosphere that seemed to match the sinister nature of what was taking place behind the ornate doors. At precisely 10 o'clock, Marcus heard Lady Blackthorn's voice begin what sounded like a normal lesson on royal protocol. However, within minutes, the tone shifted dramatically. The governess's voice became increasingly harsh and critical as she berated the exhausted child for her failures throughout the day. Marcus could hear Princess Isabel's quiet responses becoming more and more subdued as the session continued. What Marcus witnessed next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lady Blackthorn's psychological abuse escalated to a level that was nothing short of torture. She systematically attacked every aspect of the princess's identity, telling her that she was weak, stupid, and unworthy of her royal birthright. The governess claimed that everyone in the palace was disgusted by her behavior, and that only through complete submission and constant improvement could she hope to earn even basic respect? The most heartbreaking moment came when Marcus heard Princess Isabel's small voice break as she whispered, "Please, don't leave me with her," apparently addressing some imaginary figure who might rescue her from this nightmare. Lady Blackthorn's response was swift and cruel, telling the child that no one cared enough about her to intervene and that she would remain under her guidance until she learned to be grateful for the correction she was receiving. Marcus had heard enough. Every instinct as a protector and every fiber of his moral being demanded immediate action. He could no longer stand by and allow this abuse to continue, regardless of the political consequences or threats to his own position. The 8-year-old princess was being systematically destroyed by someone who was supposed to be caring for her education and well-being. Drawing his sword quietly from its sheath, Marcus approached the door. He had made his decision, and nothing would prevent him from protecting Princess Isabel. However, before he could act, he heard footsteps approaching from the opposite direction. Sir Edmund appeared, his face grave with concern and determination. "The king and queen have returned early," Sir Edmund whispered urgently. Their carriage was spotted approaching the main gates. "Lady Blackthorn doesn't know yet, but they'll be here within minutes." This unexpected development changed everything. Marcus realized that this might be the perfect opportunity to expose Lady Blackthorn's abuse in a way that couldn't be covered up or dismissed. If their majesties could witness firsthand what was happening to their daughter, no amount of political pressure could prevent justice from being served. The two men positioned themselves strategically in the corridor as the sound of approaching voices echoed from the main staircase. The king's voice carried clearly as he discussed his eagerness to see his daughter and hear about her progress with her new governess. The queen's voice revealed her own anticipation at reuniting with Princess Isabel after their extended absence. Marcus felt his heart racing as he prepared to guide their majesties to witness the truth about what had been happening in their absence. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and Lady Blackthorn's reign of psychological terror was about to come to an abrupt end. However, he also knew that the next few minutes would be crucial in determining how the situation was handled, and whether Princess Isabel would receive the protection and healing she desperately needed. As the royal footsteps grew closer, and Lady Blackthorn's harsh voice continued to assault the exhausted child behind the door, Marcus prepared to take the action that would change everything. The princess's plea of "don't leave me with her" echoed in his mind, strengthening his resolve to ensure that she would never again be subjected to such cruelty. The time for patience and proper channels had passed. Princess Isabel's welfare demanded immediate and decisive action, and Marcus was prepared to face any consequences that resulted from protecting the child who had been entrusted to his care. Part 5. The king and queen approached the corridor leading to Princess Isabel's chambers with the joy of parents eager to reunite with their beloved daughter. They had been away for nearly 3 weeks, handling delicate negotiations with neighboring kingdoms, and were looking forward to hearing about their daughter's progress with her new governess. Their expectation was to find their child asleep and peaceful, ready to greet them with excitement in the morning. Marcus stepped forward from the shadows, his heart pounding but his resolve unwavering. "Your Majesties," he said quietly, bowing respectfully while keeping his voice low enough not to alert Lady Blackthorn to their presence. "Before you continue, there is something of utmost importance that requires your immediate attention." The king's expression shifted from surprise to concern as he recognized the gravity in Marcus's tone. "Captain Thornfield, what is the meaning of this?" "We were told that Princess Isabel was progressing well under Lady Blackthorn's instruction." "Your Majesty," Marcus replied, "I must ask you to listen carefully to what is happening behind that door before you make your presence known. What you will hear will shock and horrify you, but it is the truth about what your daughter has been enduring in your absence." The queen's face paled as she heard Lady Blackthorn's harsh voice continuing to berate their daughter. The words that reached their ears were so cruel and inappropriate that both monarchs stood frozen in disbelief. They heard their 8-year-old daughter being told she was worthless, a disappointment, and a burden to everyone around her. The psychological abuse was so severe that even the battle-hardened king felt his hands trembling with rage. When they heard Princess Isabel's heartbreaking plea of "don't leave me with her," the queen's maternal instincts overcame all other considerations. She moved toward the door, but Marcus gently but firmly stepped in front of her. "Your Majesty," he said urgently, Lady Blackthorn must not know you have returned until we can ensure Princess Isabel's safety. Sir Edmund is prepared to summon the palace guards to detain the governess, and Mrs. Hartwell is standing by to provide immediate comfort to the princess. We must handle this carefully to minimize further trauma to your daughter." The king's face had transformed from confusion to barely contained fury. The man who had negotiated peace treaties and handled complex diplomatic crises found himself facing a situation that threatened to unleash a rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. "How long has this been happening?" he demanded, his voice tight with control. "For weeks, Your Majesty," Marcus replied. "I have been documenting everything, and I have witnesses among the palace staff who have observed the systematic psychological abuse your daughter has endured. Lady Blackthorn has been breaking down Princess Isabel's spirit through constant criticism, isolation, and emotional manipulation." Sir Edmund appeared silently with 3 trusted palace guards who had been briefed on the situation. The scholarly gentleman's usually gentle demeanor had been replaced by a steely determination to see justice served. Mrs. Hartwell also materialized from a side corridor, her motherly face set in grim lines as she prepared to comfort the traumatized child. The king nodded grimly to Marcus, giving him silent permission to proceed. The captain raised his hand, and at his signal, the palace guards moved into position around the door. Marcus himself stepped forward and knocked firmly. "Lady Blackthorn," he called out in an authoritative voice, "by order of their majesties, you will open this door immediately and step away from Princess Isabel." The sudden silence from within the chamber was deafening. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Lady Blackthorn's shocked face. Her usual composed demeanor cracked as she saw the assembled group, and her pale eyes darted between the guards, Marcus, and the king and queen whose expressions promised consequences beyond her worst nightmares. "Your Majesties," she began, attempting to regain her composure, "I wasn't informed of your return. Princess Isabel and I were just finishing her evening studies." "Evening studies?" the queen repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "At this hour? With the methods we just overheard?" Princess Isabel appeared in the doorway behind Lady Blackthorn, her small face streaked with tears, and her eyes wide with confusion and fear. When she saw her parents' relief and terror warred in her expression. She had been so thoroughly conditioned to believe she was a disappointment that she seemed afraid even of their reaction. Mrs. Hartwell immediately moved forward, gently guiding the princess away from Lady Blackthorn and into her protective embrace. The motherly housekeeper whispered soothing words as she led the traumatized child to safety, while the guards stepped forward to detain the governess. "Lady Cordelia Blackthorn," the king announced formally, "you are under arrest for the abuse and mistreatment of a member of the royal family. You will be confined to the palace dungeons pending a full investigation into your actions." As the governess was led away, her composure finally cracked completely. She began making threats about diplomatic consequences and demanding to contact the nobles who had recommended her. However, her words fell on deaf ears. The evidence of her crimes was overwhelming, and no political consideration could excuse what she had done to an innocent child. The aftermath of that night transformed the palace. Princess Isabel required months of gentle care and counseling to recover from the psychological trauma she had endured. Sir Edmund resumed his role as her tutor, focusing on rebuilding her love of learning through patience and encouragement. Hartwell became her unofficial guardian, ensuring that the child felt safe and protected at all times. Marcus was commended by their majesties for his courage in protecting the princess, and was promoted to head of royal security. His willingness to risk his career to save Princess Isabel became legendary among the palace staff, cementing his reputation as a man of unshakable moral courage. Lady Blackthorn faced trial for her crimes and was sentenced to exile from the kingdom. The investigation revealed that she had indeed been dismissed from previous positions for similar abuse, information that had been concealed by the nobles who recommended her for their own political purposes. Most importantly, Princess Isabel slowly began to heal. With love, patience, and the support of those who truly cared for her well-being, she gradually rediscovered her curiosity, creativity, and joy. The experience had changed her, but it had also revealed the strength of character that would serve her well as a future queen. The lesson learned by all was that no political consideration, no matter how important, could justify the abuse of those who depended on others for protection. Marcus's courage in pushing past the aides and protocol to save Princess Isabel became a reminder that true loyalty sometimes requires the courage to act against authority when innocent lives are at stake.